Okay, whoa. Hey, welcome. Oh, wow. Thanks. You know how to make a girl feel special. I am going to get started. I know folks are still ordering and getting settled. Don't worry, moving tables and stuff is not going to bother me. So feel free to move around, find places. There's a lot of chairs up front here. You're welcome to. But this is going to be packed full of a lot of information. I wanted to do the topic justice, but also keep it within our designated 30-minute time frame to be respectful of our host, the Boathouse Brew Pub. So welcome. My name is Jess Edberg. I am your host this evening. And History Happy Hour, the goal is to inform and inspire and educate folks on local Ely history, focusing on a different topic of interest every month. Right now, this is the last happy hour that we'll have here at the Boathouse for the season. I'll be back in October with a spooky themed topic. But over the summertime, I may or may not take a hiatus. That is TBD at the moment. But let me qualify, I am not an expert on Ely history. I am just an enthusiast, and I enjoy finding interesting stories to share about our shared community. And so tonight's program is about creating the boundary waters. I'm definitely not going to cover every single piece of information, but I think I did a darn good job at getting most of it. But I'll provide some resources to get more information afterwards. So again, I want to thank our hosts, the Boathouse Brew Pub. They allow this program to happen free of charge, which is very generous. And so please find a beverage of choice and support the Boathouse. Also, the Ely Folk School and Boundary Waters Connect, supporting this program with assistance in education on using audiovisual equipment. And then, of course, the speakers that we have. The Ely Heritage Preservation Commission, which is a city commission that provides support and wonderful resources. And then the Dorothy Moulter Museum, which is my employer, and they allow me to do work for this program during work time because part of our mission is to inspire people to be excited about history. So, creating the boundary waters, it's more than just the wilderness, right? So when we think about the boundary waters, when anybody thinks about the boundary waters across the world, it's very likely the majority of people imagine a remote location full of pure waters and wildlife-rich forests and wetlands navigated primarily by canoe. And rightly so, this vast wilderness, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, or BW or BWCA, I might use those interchangeably, extends 150 miles along the US-Canadian border, covering approximately 1,098,000 acres, with over 1,100 lakes, 1,500 miles of canoe routes, and more than 2,000 designated campsites, attracting more than 150,000 visitors annually. But to truly understand the physical nature of this incredible destination, you do need to come and experience it for yourself. And I believe many in this room have. Probably many, many, many times. But to truly understand the history of this amazing public natural resource, and what the majority of folks do not usually think about, is understanding its lengthy and tumultuous origins. Since its designation as a wilderness under the '64 Wilderness Act, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, each land use change to the boundary waters has resulted in a fresh controversy. Yet even with the challenges of opposing viewpoints and pointed arguments, the communities surrounding the boundary waters value this awe-inspiring natural resource and strive to protect it for the foreseeable future through a general appreciation for and value of its existence despite this tumultuous history. And as a federal wilderness, we are all stewards of the boundary waters, responsible for its ongoing management and use regardless of our permanent zip code. Like any controversial issue, many factors influence our understanding and perception. But one thing is true, knowing what makes an issue controversial helps develop an informed opinion. However, we are not here to discuss the best path forward through the very thick weeds that are currently being navigated on the political landscape of today. This is History Happy Hour. So we are going to focus on the backstory before where we're at right now. And you are welcome to continue this conversation downstairs with more beer afterwards, because everybody knows beer and controversy go really well together. So let's start at the beginning. 4.5 billion years ago, our solar system was born of a dense cloud of interstellar gas and dust collapsing, spinning, and swirling into a disk of material. Just kidding, we're not going that far back. 2.7 billion years ago, how do you find humor in a topic that can sometimes be a little dry? It's a lot of legislative stuff. So trying to find the humor, hoping. So, okay, we are going back about 14,000 years ago to the glacial maximum of the Laurentide ice sheet, which began to recede permanently over the next handful of 1,000 years. In our neck of the woods, it left behind bare bedrock and glacial erratics, those big boulders or rocks. Within a few thousand years, the Paleo-Indians moved into or back into the area, since there's no known physical evidence of pre-glacial human settlement because glaciers were here. So over the next several thousands of years, the ecology of the landscape developed into a rich boreal forest along with the human cultural landscape. And the cultural diversification of early indigenous peoples is difficult to fully understand, as those stories were so long ago and were not written down, and oral history sometimes didn't survive for us, non-indigenous person, to understand fully. So to scientifically quantify these changes, archaeologists created archaeological periods characterized a lot by the types of things they found in or on the ground, such as projectile points, which projectile points is a big factor, or imagery drawn or carved onto exposed rock. And these periods include climatic changes that also affected the plant, insect, and animal composition of the landscape. About 2,500 years ago, until first contact with Europeans began in about 1650, the woodland period began. This period was signaled with an innovation in religious rituals, such as burial mounds, adoption of pottery making, plant cultivation, and forest manipulation, such as setting forest fires, and the birth of the bow and arrow, which small projectile points. Historically, the Minnesota region was strategically important to Native American peoples for thousands of years, as they used the waterways for transportation and food, and to develop an extensive trade relationship with other Native peoples all down the Mississippi River. With European contact in 1650, Boundary Waters history becomes dominated by both the fur trade, initiated by the French, and great tribal conflicts and movements of the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples. And the wilderness that we're talking about this evening, or that I'm talking at you about this evening, is part of a history that took place on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands and water of the Ojibwe peoples in the ceded territory of the 1854 treaty boundary. This treaty, the Treaty of La Pointe, was the first major treaty ceding land to the United States in this region, and this time period included significant population declines of native tribes from European diseases, the land forcibly taken when no good faith effort was made for trade. It'll get less depressing in a little bit here. It also signaled the discontinuation of stone tools and native pottery due to the availability of European trade goods. Very quickly, in the 1860s, European immigrants began homesteading in the area and established early mining and logging industries. And the arrival of railroads in the 1880s propelled the logging and mining industry growth, as well as an increase in European immigrants and the segregation through resettlement of Native Americans to reservation lands. Commercial harvests of white and red pine saw timber in northeastern Minnesota from the 1880s to the 1930s change the landscape significantly, as we could all imagine. These man-made disturbances resulted in a changed and often damaged ecosystem, which prompted a review of land management in the area and ushering in a transition of values toward the forest landscape from a utilitarian perspective to that of a multiple use ideal, both at the federal and state level. And Forestry Commissioner at the time, General C.C. Andrews, was an advocate for scientific forest management and responsible logging during a time when commercial logging operations often employed unethical and fraudulent business tactics. He stated state forest reserves should be devoted not alone to the business of raising timber, but to the pleasure of all the people. In short order, U.S. Land Office withdrew 500,000 acres of land from new settlement in 1902. Following suit, state of Minnesota established the 20,000 acre Burnside Forest Reserve in 1904. The U.S. Forest Service was created in 1905. Oh, am I getting ahead of myself? There we go. And their job was to sustain healthy, diverse, and productive landscapes for present and future generations. That same year, General C.C. Andrews began work to withdraw an additional 660,000 acres from settlement. In 1909, oops, again, ahead of myself. 1909, President Roosevelt established the Superior National Forest, with Minnesota once again following suit, creating the 1.2 million acre Superior Game Refuge, unknowingly setting the framework for a designated wilderness area in an effort to protect and save the threatened moose and woodland caribou populations. Have a drink for the woodland caribou that we no longer have. Congress further limited the potential for development in the forest with the 1911 Weeks that supported private land buyouts to protect the headwaters of rivers and watersheds. Of course, World War I put a damper on forest management and for a few years, but the post-World War I economic boom enabled an increase in the recreational industry that, coupled with an increase in leisure time for the middle class, flourished in this Boundary Waters region. Forest landscape architect Arthur Carhart published a recreational and development plan for the forest, Superior National Forest, in 1921, which included managing portions strictly for canoe travel. And concurrent with the expanding tourism industry of summer home and resort development, the first Forest Service land management plan was developed in an attempt to balance primitive recreation and commercial interests, allowing for expansion of access into remote areas of the forest with the construction of the Echo, Fernberg, and Upper Gunflint trails from 1922 to 1926. In 1926, U.S. Agriculture Secretary Jardine created a policy to, quote, retain as much as possible of the land which has recreational opportunities of this nature as a wilderness. Then withdrawing 640,000 acres from the Superior National Forest from any development and designating the Superior, Caribou, and Little Indian Sioux roadless areas. And these areas would eventually become the core acreage of the future Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. Renewed logging activity increased tourist traffic, and proposed damming of waterways created controversy over potential stress on natural resources and the, quote, wilderness character of the area, leading to new state and federal laws, including the Shipstead-Newton-Nolan Act in 1930, prohibiting dams and logging within 400 feet of shoreline, and the state of Minnesota's Little Shipstead-Newton-Nolan Act of 1933, bolstering that federal act. Additionally, logging is then prohibited in 362,000 acres along the international boundary. Boundary changes and purchase agreements increased the Superior National Forest to over 2 million acres. However, recreational use dropped significantly during the Great Depression, understandably. And as a result, the Forest Service acquired more tax delinquent land, while the newly established Civilian Conservation Corps worked on improving portages and building new foot trails within that expanding Superior National Forest. In 1934, President Roosevelt designates the Quetico Superior Committee to work on conservation, preservation, and use of northeastern Minnesota's wilderness areas. However, again, World War II, another fun war, brought another slump in the recreational use of the region. In 1936, Forest Service combined the Superior Caribou and Little Indian Sioux roadless areas into the singular Superior Roadless Primitive Area. And in the years after World War II, there was a rapid growth in both new resorts and a higher demand for wood products. And in 1948, the Forest Service changed the boundaries of the roadless area to accommodate the demand for wood by removing acreage near the Lake Isabella and Pushwe Lake to accommodate logging needs and roads. Those opposed to development worked to enact another act, the Ty-Blotnick Bill, which appropriated $500,000 to the Forest Service to acquire private lands within the Superior National Forest through exchange, purchase, or condemnation of privately held lands. By the end of that year, private landowners were being sent solicitations to buy them out. Back-to-back controversies continued for the next 2 decades. The flight ban of 1949 was an executive order by President Truman establishing an airspace boundary over the roadless area, effectively ending a popular type of recreation, the remote fly-in resort. This move was highly controversial, and again, the state of Minnesota followed suit with air and watercraft limitations as well. Resort operators had until 1951 to halt air traffic within the roadless area, forcing many to close up shop. Sigurd Olson, one of the area's most iconic figures, was one of the major opponents of fly-in resorts, as he believed they compromised the wilderness environment and affected the long-term sustainability of the fisheries. He was an active participant in supporting the flight ban. Olson had been very involved in other management changes to the area, including a campaign to support what eventually became the Shipstead-Newton-Nolan and Little Shipstead-Newton-Nolan Act in the 30s. This work made Olson a popular name and leader in the conservation movement, but also painted a target on his back for those opposed to those changes. The use of motorized portages, motorboats, and snowmobiles would continue to be a heated subject as well. Flight bans and motor restrictions were met with great opposition in many local communities. Yet still, the idea of a designated federal wilderness was gaining speed, and in 1958, the Superior Roadless Area officially became the Boundary Waters Canoe Area. In an effort to support the multiple use concept for national forests, Congress passed the 1960 Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, promoting sustainable logging. Eventually, the total amount allotted for federal land acquisition from private owners would reach $4.5 million, which is a lot of money back then. With full authority to invoke eminent domain on properties that would not sell, forcing some landowners to take losses on property values or risk condemnation. Some resorts moved their businesses across the border into Ontario to find relief. Those of you familiar with the story of Dorothy Moulter know that it was a painful process for landowners in some cases. In 1964, U.S. Agriculture Secretary Orville Freeman appointed the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Review Committee, generally known as the Selkie Committee, to recommend changes in management, and the battle over access to the roadless area came to a fever pitch when protesting loggers bulldozed soil into Finn Lake off the Gunflint Trail in opposition to logging restrictions. The quote, Finn Lake incident became a rallying cry for further Boundary Waters protections, and in short order, the 1964 Wilderness Act was passed by Congress, making the Boundary Waters part of the newly designated wilderness preservation system and prohibiting permanent residency or business operation within its boundaries. The Wilderness Act included a clause that allowed some logging and use of motors to continue, which was updated in 1965 with an increase in no-cut areas, motorboat zoning, snowmobiling limitations, and a visitor registration process. Demonstrations against these changes were held in Ely and other surrounding communities, and Elyite Sigurd Olson was a target once again having been an active participant in the creation of and passing of the Wilderness Act. Remaining properties within the newly designated Boundary Waters Canoe Area were condemned, including Dorothy Moulters. After public pressure to allow her to stay, federal officials agreed to buy Dorothy and by default Benny Ambrose's property, and both were allowed to stay on their land until 1975. We know they were both granted lifetime tenancy by the early 70s. Even back then, going viral was a thing, and intense public scrutiny held a lot of power, even if it was behind a pen and paper instead of a computer screen. By 1966, no-fee, non-limiting boundary waters permits were instituted, and a new controversy erupted over proposed copper nickel mining near the area of the boundary waters. From 68 to 77, intense arguments and litigation ensued over the management of the newly established boundary waters. Precious metal prospecting created concern over impacts to the vast watershed. Use of motorized transportation was fought for and against. Virgin forests were stuck in a tug of war between opposing interests. Regulations on group sizes, whether you could take canned goods into the wilderness, and even peat harvesting was hotly debated. Fun fact, how many of you know that some of the early recommendations for getting rid of your used cans were to make sure there were holes poked in the bottom and you went to the deepest part of the lake? And there were a lot of other things where that happened as well. In 1974, new Forest Service management plan allowed continued logging and motor use within the boundary waters. So in an effort to reach compromise, Congressman Jim Oberstar tried to establish a two-zone system, but was woefully unsuccessful, and logging litigation continued on. In 1978, Congress enacted the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness Act, which officially prohibited logging, restricted mining, and limited motorboats to specific routes within the wilderness, and had a timeline to phase out snowmobiles entirely. Boundary adjustments brought its size to just over 1 million acres, and the Boundary Waters was now officially called the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, and once again, protests erupted. Although the intention of this act was to find compromise between groups advocating different levels of motor use, challenges to its validity by both the state of Minnesota and other groups continued from 79 to 82, but the act was upheld. In 1982, August, Benny Ambrose died, and in December of 86, Dorothy Moulter died, the last non-Indigenous permanent resident occupying private property within the Boundary Waters Area Canoe Wilderness. Both properties were then reclaimed by the Forest Service. To fund continued implementation of the 1978 Boundary Waters Wilderness Act, Congress appropriated a total of $84 million in 1990 to Minnesota and to the Forest Service. Not surprisingly, litigation continued, throughout the next decade over the use of motorized portages, types of boats allowed, revocation of property owner exemption permits, and disputes over management. This included challenges to 3 motorized portages that lagged on from 91 to 1998, leaving the Prairie and Trout Lake truck portages motorized. A 1998 Boundary Waters user fee program began to surprise more frustration. Just when you thought things might mellow out for a little bit, a huge straight line windstorm came up with speeds of up to 90 miles an hour and left extensive blowdown on nearly half of the boundary waters, rekindling discussions over logging in the boundary waters. With wildfires an inevitable hazard due to extensive tree damage, the Forest Service began a prescribed burn program. Excuse me, a prescribed burn program along the wilderness boundary to mitigate potential damage from fire. However, regardless of the cause, wildfire management remains its own controversial issue. And with the advent of social media, many people have thoughts to share, and they certainly do. Opposition to development of radio and cell towers and a new snowmobile trail outside of, but close to, the boundary waters also provoked more litigation and renewed tension over proposed copper nickel mining on the edge of the boundary waters continues the pattern of controversy over how to manage the wilderness for all. And one thing I didn't include in this is a potential discussion over towboats going into motorized area. That is also another controversy that's coming up. Competing interests, values, and beliefs inevitably produce tension and opposing views between individuals and groups, requiring land managers to continually examine all perspectives. It seems that there will never be a time where there is not a battle to be fought over the boundary waters. However, we too can become active participants and explore the human element of wilderness management. Like any controversial issue, understanding the history is paramount in developing an informed opinion. Now, managing your own personal biases on the issues is another program, and I am not doing that program ever. If you would like to learn more about the history of the boundary waters, Ely has a wealth of resources. For one, the Kwishiri Ranger Station, which is located just outside of town to the east, has a wonderful visitor area in its entrance with exhibits and provide information resources to folks that would like to go visit. Dorothy Moulter Museum has an exhibit called Creating the Boundary Waters, 25 Objects, 25 Stories, which is similar to this program, but in a more timeline fashion. And if you're interested in learning more about Sigurd Olson and what was he about and why was he here and was he such a controversial figure, Listening Point Foundation offers tours and information services. So please get in touch with them as well. But don't forget, we also have a wealth of resources just within our own community with people that grew up during these changes in this time, and talking to them and asking them what their lived experience and their personal beliefs are can help you round out your own informed opinion about this controversial issue if you would like to. With that being said, I made it in just under a half an hour. This is like 40 slides. This is the longest one I've ever done. I would like to recognize all of the resources that I use, which if you have not been here before, I use publicly available resources for information. So you then can see that you are able to actually access these resources. A lot of different historical societies, newspapers, especially from the 60s and 70s information. And then U.S. Forest Service, Listening Point Foundation, Dorothy Moulter Museum, and the Minnesota Historical Society provided a lot of information for this program. Again, thank you to all of the organizations and the businesses that support this program. We're going to be taking a break here for the summer because the boathouse would like to utilize this space as a dining area once we get into our really busy season. And so the plan of action is to be back up here the third Wednesday of October with a fun, maybe kind of scary story. We'll see. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting this program, and have a wonderful summer. Feel free to move it while I'm talking. If there's another tall chair, I can move this. The stand wasn't working, so I didn't want to risk it.